There are those situations where we don't have a closing disclosure until, right before closing, maybe even an hour before closing. It's not ideal, but it does happen.
Hey, everybody, welcome back to another episode of The Real Estate Show. I'm Tiffany Weber, a real estate attorney in North Carolina with Thomas & Weber, and I have my favorite new guest back. We have Layla. Good to see you today.
Good to see you too.
Thank you so much for joining me again. I hopefully didn't scare you off the last time. You had such good points last time that I was like, we got to do it again. So today's episode, we are going to talk about the things that before a buyer closes on a house, what should they really be doing? And the first one is my favorite one. And I got to make sure I give you credit. You came up with all of these. I'm like, everything you said, I'm like, yep. Like, no notes, 10 out of 10. So the first one that you had on your list was survey. Why are surveys so important?
So this is my number one, and it's amazing to me how often buyers don't get surveys, but I get it. I mean, they can be expensive. It can range anywhere $700 to $1,000, just depending. But at the end of the day, a survey ensures that you know what you're purchasing, and that's it's valuable. You may have a neighboring property that has a fence encroaching on the new land that you're purchasing. And if you discover that before closing, then that's something that can be worked out.
Your best leverage before you close.
Exactly. An encroachment agreement with that neighbor. Lots of things too that you can address, prior to closing. So really, this is going to be one of your biggest investments in life, and just knowing exactly what it is you're getting, I just think is crucial.
Yeah, and there's people like, well, I can just see it on GIS. Well, GIS is not accurate as to property lines. Like, it's pretty dang close most of the time, but you can't rely upon that to show you like let's look at the stake. Where are the stakes supposed to be? Where is my property line? GIS can't show you that. You get a good idea. I can think of an example from, this has probably been 5 years ago now, where a client didn't get a survey, and after closing, like GIS, again, you can't really rely on it. It wasn't evident from GIS that there might be an issue. Property line legitimately went here's the house, about 2/3 through the house was the property line. House was built partially on the neighbor's property.
Wow.
Yeah. Survey could have told him that before he ever closed. And that's, I'd say, a pretty severe title issue that the contract requires a seller to remedy in some way, shape, or form, because they got to convey clear title. And then, the encroachments you bring up such a good point about, because some encroachments are, maybe you don't care, but that doesn't mean the problem goes away. So having the knowledge of a problem, even if you choose to accept said problem, could be really important when you go to sell your property someday. Because you're essentially, say the fence is encroaching. You're like, not worried about that. Your future buyer might care. And then that would be your problem to accept or to remedy at that point. So you may want to negotiate, what would it cost me to move this fence if I ever had to? And you work that into the contract in some way. But you don't know any of those things if you don't actually get a survey. So I'm with you. It's my number one as well. Your next thing, lenders monitoring your credit, and not just to when you first apply. What are they doing during the closing process?
Oh, right. So, once you talk to your lender for the first time and, you get your pre-qualification letter, you're, of course, going through your process where you're providing documentation to support your income and your assets. During that entire period, not everyone realizes that lenders are monitoring your credit. They're
Big brother is watching.
Exactly. Right up until closing day. So if, you decided you were going to buy a new car during that time, maybe you're getting a lake house and you wanted to get that boat ready. So you went and got yourself a boat. Or maybe even just a new big screen TV. Put all of that off until after closing day, because every inquiry on your credit report, that lender is going to scrutinize, and it will create perhaps extra paperwork and potentially even closing delays as a worst case scenario.
Did I ever tell you the story about a client who was doing a refinance that had to be delayed because of vehicles?
No.
Um, well, one thing, the summary I feel like is delay gratification a little bit. Wait for the TV. The sunset cruise on the lake can wait. This client was coming to do a refinance of his primary home. Um, he was running late to the closing. His lender was there. Lender knows him very well. I know Lender pretty well, and she was getting very nervous. Like something's up. This is kind of strange. She's pacing the room. And we were up here on this floor still, so we were just in one of those conference rooms. She's pacing the room. She looks out the window and she sees a brand new truck, clearly brand new truck, driving into the parking lot.
Oh, no.
She immediately starts doing math, looking at his file because she says, "I know that's him. I know that's him driving in with the new truck." By the time he gets upstairs, she's like, "Okay, I've called, I've sent an email. I'm going to call. I think, based on what that purchase price of that truck probably was, I think we're going to be okay on DTI, debt to income ratios. We might be okay." And he sits down and she said, "You know what? You might get lucky here as long as you didn't buy 2 of those." And he said, "I did." And I'm like,
No
I was like,
way.
"No, you didn't." He's like, I did. I mean, I can only drive one of them at a time, but it's for my business." And she's like, "Oh, good. It's for your business." He said, "But I put them in my name. I'll transfer them into the business later."
Oh, no.
Was late to the closing for buying 2 new trucks.
Wow.
We didn't close that day.
Needless to say.
Yeah. 9 months later, he refinanced. And this was before COVID interest rates. So it's not like it was a benefit to him. Like he didn't get a better interest rate that 9 months later. It was like the same or maybe a little bit higher. But it's like one of those things that like, that's only going to happen once in my career that I'll see that happen. But it stuck with me so much that I'm like, stop buying. People don't buy stuff. Just leave it alone. Your lender will thank you. And so will your closing attorney. Oh, and I know another attorney who was informed by a client at the closing table about a big purchase they had just made. The lender didn't know, but I mean, we have a duty, like he's like, "I gotta go tell your lender this now. Like, I don't know what's going to happen with your closing. I don't know if you're going to be able to close or not, but I can't unknow what you've just told me. And now your
Right.
lender is entitled to know."
Well,
and
not to mention there's so many disclosures in the loan package anyway. I mean, it would have to come out.
Yes, it would, unless you're just untruthful, which is also bad,
Yeah.
called mortgage fraud. And it's the FBI that comes knocking, not the Mooresville PD. Now, the next thing you mentioned, you wish buyers before they close would review their closing disclosure.
Yes. So there are those situations where we don't have a closing disclosure until, right before closing, maybe even an hour before closing.
Right.
It's not ideal, but it does happen. But ideally, we have these closing disclosures available 1, maybe 2 days in advance, maybe even more. So when those are available, I always stress, look at it right away.
Yeah.
Because, when we're sitting down at the closing table and we're going through the closing disclosure, it takes some time to make changes, especially in a situation where maybe your lender's in California and we're sitting down for a 9 a.m. closing. And, your lender's not going to be available for several more hours on Pacific time. And so then, it really derails things.
Yeah.
So, because every change that is made on a closing disclosure, it has to be done on the lender side with lender approval. It's not something that I can do.
Right.
So I say the sooner that they look at that, the better.
Yeah. It's not a unilateral, you tell us and we can just wave a magic wand and it happens. There's so much that goes, like lenders have specific standards they have to follow about seller credits. This comes up a lot, especially they go through the walkthrough and something's not done properly. So they're negotiating a credit and they're like, "No problem. We'll just put on the closing statement." Maybe the lender will approve it. Like, we don't know if the lender's going to allow, it might be too much, or you might have negotiated a giant credit and the client can't use all of it. So, it's a little bit off topic of the importance of reviewing a CD before closing, but I'm thinking so much about like, at the table is not the best time to be making changes if we've had an opportunity already to do so. And also, I don't know about you, but by the time I'm going over the closing disclosure, like once I get about halfway down the first page, I can tell if a client's looked at it or not. You're getting the nods, like, got it. There's body language that you can tell if someone's looked at it or not. And it's the entire closing is less stressful for a borrower that's looked at the CD beforehand. They don't really care about the other loan documents. What they care about on the note is the interest rate correct? Is my loan amount correct? But all of the rest of it, they kind of understand this is the lender's requirement. If I'm going to get this money, they want this. But the closing disclosure it's the most important part of the whole loan package, making sure the dollars and cents are right. So I just get the sense from buyers that when they've looked at the CD beforehand, they're just so much more calm.
I agree. Definitely a different demeanor
Mhm.
between, because they're prepared. Nothing on there is a surprise, and it really
Yeah.
just makes you feel better about everything. Just
Yes.
being prepared.
Yes, it does. My default is when I'm going over things with the client, I kind of treat everybody like a first-time home buyer until they either tell me not to or they give me you get the feeling, and the
Mhm.
CD is really the best time that I get that feeling where I'm like, you've done this before and you've looked at this. Let's talk about how much detail you really want on
Right.
this, because I'm not going to make someone listen to me go over line by line by line everything if they're like, I've got it, But if they haven't looked at it, we've got to make sure that it's right. It's what they expected. Another thing is the closing attorney, we're the legal people. We're not necessarily the numbers people. We don't create these numbers.
Mhm.
We're not, other than our fees, we're not generating any of the numbers on that closing statement. So we require input from multiple other parties to make sure that they're accurate. So it takes review of a lot of people, especially the borrower, to make sure that all of it is exactly where it should be. As much as I'd love if we got everything 100% right all the time, it takes good inputs to get good outputs too sometimes. So I love that was on your list. Next thing that you had was wiring before closing, if possible. So talk to me through, why would you do that? What happens if you don't? Give me a little bit of context around that one.
Oh, sure. So, basically you can come in and have your signing appointment, but you're not closed until we've recorded the deed. And
Mhm.
of course, we can't do anything unless we have the funds.
Mhm.
So, we talked about the timeline of closing disclosures. If that closing disclosure is available a few days before closing, I always say, here's the number. Go ahead and
Mhm.
send us the wire now.
Mhm.
We'll have it in our trust account. We'll hold it until closing day.
Yeah.
In some situations, there may be some minor tweaks to the closing disclosure up until, the closing day. Maybe there are a couple numbers that aren't certain. Let's say the closing date had changed, and so
Mhm.
maybe your homeowner's insurance premium is going to be altered slightly from that change in the day.
Mhm.
So if there's anything that isn't quite certain, then I always recommend, take a look at what your cash to close is at this point. Maybe round up a little bit, send a little bit
Mhm.
of extra money, and then again, we'll hold it, and then we can cut a check back to you
Mhm.
at the closing table. Um, because again, buyers cash to close their funds, being delayed is one of the biggest sources of delay
Right.
that I've seen. I had one situation where the buyer wired from an investment account
Mhm.
and had no idea that there was a 3-day waiting period for us to get that wire.
Mhm.
And they
They got to sell
initiated.
off stocks to be able to send the money, right?
Exactly. So we're sitting there at the closing table, and we had gone through all the documents, and he said, okay, well, I'm going to initiate my wire now. And it was an investment account, and we waited and waited, and all of a sudden it was 3 days. On the 4th
Mhm.
day, we finally got to record. But
You had a
he had
seller
no
that was
idea.
upset, I'm sure.
We sure did.
Yeah.
We sure did. So, number one, I would say long before the closing day, figure out where your funds are coming from, get an idea of how long it will take for those wire transfers to come in, and then never be afraid to just wire funds early. Because
Right.
again, we'll just hold it. It's not going to hurt anything.
Mhm.
And it's one more thing that you can check off your task list
Right.
before closing day.
Yeah, and then you're not trying to verify wire instructions while you're also trying to find the attorney's office and, finish your walkthrough. It's just too hectic on the day of. Um, and another thing about that, I love that you brought up the investment account and the 3-day thing from doing it at the table, because you also, depending on who you bank with, might have to initiate wires in person.
Yes.
And, we've seen the heartbreakers where someone's here signing their documents. They're trying to initiate a wire online. to not be able to, and they call their bank, and the bank has a policy that they'll only initiate wires in person. And guess what? That bank only has physical branches in Maryland. And I'm thinking Maryland because that was the state that the one that I'm thinking of applied to. And it really is sad to see a borrower like in tears because they're like, what do you mean? I've got to drive or fly to Maryland to initiate these funds, and unfortunately, we have no influence or say over a bank's procedures. So, one, where are your funds coming from? Two, how are you able to send the funds? If maybe you are able to initiate a wire online, but is there a limit? Are you going to, maybe the app says you can send up to 25,000, but you need 47. What's the plan? And I love nobody wants to spend any more money or have any more money tied up than they should, but would much rather cut you a check back at the closing table than you be trying to figure out how to make up a difference. Not a lot of people carry personal checks anymore, and not every attorney will accept a personal check for any amount. And if they do accept one at all, there will be an upper limit on the amount that they're willing to take. So that's a really good one. And then you also had ID expiration.
Yes.
I'm guessing you've dealt with this one.
Oh, I have.
Tell me about it.
Well, it's, if you are closing on a house, just take a quick look at your government issued photo ID and make sure that it isn't expired and it isn't going to expire before the closing date.
Right.
Because notary requirements are very strict here in North Carolina. You have to have a valid government photo ID. And if it's expired, it's not valid. So definitely something to just take a quick look at, put that on the checklist.
Absolutely. Like, there should be like a closing timeline checklist of a month before do this, like whenever, like your spring cleaning checklist. I don't know if you've ever used one of those. You strike me as someone like you probably just have it mentally cataloged of like, every April 1st, I'm going to do this. And, but those spring cleaning checklist of, do this every week. A week, 2 weeks before. Is it expired? Is it expiring? Because even though the notary manual gives us some other ways to validate a person's identity, the stars have to align. That like we have to know the people that are vouching for you. If we don't personally know that, that I can't remember if it's so rare that we're even able to use this procedure. But like by personally knowing two people that also personally know the signer, like that's how are the stars going to align for that? And it can't be someone interested in the transaction. So it can't be your real estate agent.
Right. So there are some very narrow ways around it, but
extremely narrow.
It would be unlikely in most situations that we would be able to get around that. So, the Costco card isn't going to cut it.
No,
we need the real deal.
Like I've got my utility bill. Really not helpful in this situation. I'm so sorry. Like I know you have to use it to enroll your kids in school or whatever, but it's not going to help you here. And it's another one of those things where we wish we had some influence over it, but we don't. We don't make the laws. We just interpret them and carry them out in our functions. But I think those are so important. I love that this is, what came to mind for you of like, what do we wish buyers did before closing?
Absolutely. It's supposed to really be a fun and positive experience. I mean, buying property, it's an exciting time.
There's a reason we got out of litigation, right?
Exactly. Everybody's happy.
Yes. Most of the time.
But, and just following, some of these simple items, checklist items can really make it a much more positive and enjoyable experience.
Yeah. I love it. Thank you so much, Layla.